Hello and welcome to the lecture on Italian fascism for AP European History. I'd like to direct your attention to the symbols at the top left and right of your screen. Those are called fasces, and a fasces is simply an axe surrounded by a bundle of rods and then bound together with a kind of leather strap. It's an old Roman symbol and it indicates magisterial authority or power. You could also consider it part of fascism, because fascism is kind of like that, where imagine society is made up of a whole bunch of different kinds of rods, maybe different classes of people or different types of people. And each and every one of those rods or different parts of society could easily be broken if it is standing alone. But if you put them together, if you bind them together in a kind of authoritarian state, as a fascist state is, then it becomes unassailably powerful and really unable to be broken. And that's kind of the symbol or philosophy behind fascism. Now, I hope that you remember some things about 19th century Italian unification and how it occurred under Piedmont Sardinia and Camillo di Cavour, with a little bit of help from the more radical Republican Garibaldi. Occurred through the war against Austria. France was allied with Piedmont Sardinia at that point in time, and as you remember, there were probably some problems with the Pope, because the Pope didn't want to give up his land to this new Italian state, which eventually happened. And so Italy really was formed really not very successfully in the late 19th century, and it kind of muddled through things all the way through World War I. Now, fascism is a kind of alternative to both liberalism and Marxism. If you think about liberalism as the political philosophy and economic philosophy of the middle classes, it works really quite well for them, but for others, not so much. Parliamentary democracy oftentimes, even today, seems like it devolves into interest group bickering in a parliament. Different people are voting for different things, and not much really gets done very quickly. In terms of the economy, with liberalism or parliamentary democracy, we have capitalism, of course, and there is the social question, which is, what should we do with the poor? What do we do about economic inequality? How is that solved in a kind of liberal capitalist state? And of course, there were also economic cycles that occurred from the Depression of 1873 all the way to the Great Depression of the 1920s. There are booms and there are busts, and there are ways of trying to overcome that. But in the end, there are winners and losers in capitalism. Also, in terms of liberalism, it's a lot about individual rights and individual liberties. And while that works, once again, it works really quite well for people of means and people who want their property protected. In some ways, it is psychologically unfulfilling, especially if you think about the nationalism that was developing in the late 19th century and early 20th century, where you had people, rallying around a flag or rallying around their side during a war. It's much more psychologically fulfilling to feel like you belong to something greater than yourself, that your nation perhaps will outlive you, and that the success of your nation is maybe much more important than your individual rights. I don't think I really need to say too much about fascism being an alternative to Marxism. Marxism is a great political and economic philosophy for the lowest classes, but really for anybody who does not belong to the proletariat, the idea of not having any kind of property or religion and a dictatorship of masses and everything that goes along with Marxism really is not something that most people wanted. With fascism, you have the idea of authority or strength, political strength given to people by a kind of macho strongman. It's no longer parliamentary bickering. It's no longer voting for one party or another. It's really all about this strongman who is going to decide what is right and what is fair and what is good for everyone. Fascists tend to use a lot of language of the left, or talking a lot about how economic security is important, and that everyone is an important part of the economy. even the lowest classes, the working class, shouldn't be shamed or shouldn't be put down because they are mere workers or mere proletarians. They should be embraced as part of the whole. Once again, think of that fasces. Everyone is needed in the economy and in the political system for the state to be a success. Now, this is a lot of language of the left. In reality, it demands or requires that people really don't do a lot of social mobility. Generally, you're stuck wherever you're at in a kind of fascist state. Also, fascism is generally conservative when it comes to the women's question or society in general, and women are generally expected to stay home and not have much of a say. It's going back to that separate spheres that we've always seen, and women staying at home, being mothers, raising lots of kids, and so on. Society, too, as I said, really not a lot of social mobility. There are social betters and there are social lessers and there are people in the middle, and everyone just needs to be appreciated for what they are. There are a lot of what one might consider psychologically fulfilling symbols in fascism, symbols of the right, a lot of flags, usually some sort of emblem, be it an eagle or the fasces, greetings in various ways. You'll see the right-handed salute of the Romans being used in fascist Italy. And people in uniform, a lot of uniforms, brightly colored uniforms, songs and oaths and anthems and those kinds of things. These are all symbols of the right that somehow bind people together psychologically. It's really a kind of extreme nationalism where the state is placed above everyone and everyone is allegedly together and appreciated for what they bring to the nation. It is also, as I say, a kind of system that appreciates the uniform and is generally very militaristic, placing a lot of emphasis on the power of the military and also on taking over territory and trying to dominate others, kind of a survival of the fittest once again from the 19th century, moving on into the 20th century. Here is Il Duce, or the leader or the strongman of fascist Italy, a guy by the name of Benito Mussolini. And there he is on the right, wildly gesticulating during one of his speeches, and giving you kind of a sultry look there on the left, maybe trying to mesmerize you or hypnotize you with animal magnetism. Fascism uses a lot of propaganda. You can see the fasces symbol on the left once again, and it looks like there's some sort of agricultural tool that is being bound to the rest. Maybe this is in some way designed to get the peasantry or the farmers as a part of the fascist state. And then I really appreciate this gigantic Mussolini face on the facade of a building with the word yes, 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 over and over on the facade. Imagine if you had to walk by this every single day. It's a kind of overwhelming Big Brother sort of thing that I think would seep into your psyche over time. It's very difficult to say no, no, no to Big Brother Mussolini. Fascist propaganda in Italy oftentimes harkens back to the glory days of Rome. This is a period of time that they can be particularly proud of. And I think you can see the symbology of Rome in the podium. You see what looks like a kind of Roman shield and a Roman eagle. You can see some of the people there giving a Roman salute, flags in the background, and Il Duce, or the leader, is standing at the podium ready to give a rousing speech. Here, too, is an image with a lot of young people, as I talked about with Soviet Russia. Any really totalitarian state needs to incorporate the youth that don't have any kind of preconceived notions and can be educated to be really good pawns or tools that the fascist state can use as people who are very enthusiastic about fascism. I like the symbol, too, behind the young men in the truck. You can see everyone has their hand up and a kind of swearing of an oath, and they're all rallying around the fasces. And if you could bind those young people together, you could once again have a very powerful and unassailable force. It is interesting to talk about why Italy becomes this fascist state, this authoritarian right-wing state, especially when you consider a kind of extreme revolution to the right or to the left occurring in a state that might lose a war like Russia and the Soviet Union, or Germany, and after the hyperinflation and the Great Depression, and eventually moving towards nationalism or hypernationalism of Nazism. Why Italy when Italy won World War I? Well, part of the reason for that, I think, has to do with, although Italy is on the winning side of World War I, it really doesn't get very much out of World War I. It wasn't, the Italians really didn't feel like they were rewarded for their sacrifices during the war. They certainly lost a lot of men, they spent a lot of money, and then at the end they don't get any colonies. For example, the British and the French got a lot of Ottoman territory, and they divided up the colonies in Africa between themselves, German colonies. There's also before, during, and after World War I, really very weak support for shifting governments. Every time an election happens, there are new people in power. Italy has a long history since it became a constitutional monarchy of having a lot of different governments and a lot of different political groupings going from the far left and to the far right. And so there really wasn't one government that really got a large number of Italians excited. Also, after World War I, and this usually happens, there was a kind of post-war depression because of all of the military contracts being suddenly canceled and all of these men being demobilized and coming home to no jobs. Because of that, there was a bit of social unrest at the end of World War I into the 1920s. Some social unrest in the factories, strikes, and even employers locking out workers and so on, as working class people demanded higher salaries and better working conditions. There's also some problems on the land with peasants who are renting land from landlords being unhappy and trying to seize land away from their landlords. And so these strikes, these land seizures, reminded, I think, many Italians of what had happened recently in Russia as it moved towards becoming the Soviet Union. And there's a real fear of Bolshevism. And oftentimes people go far to the right because of a fear of Marxism or Bolshevism or communism. Benito Mussolini was initially a teacher and then became the editor of a socialist newspaper. As World War I neared and as World War I broke out, he dropped socialism and became a kind of hyper-nationalist. And he has this change over time, really, from the kinds of beliefs of a socialist, from being a Republican, wanting a republic, and somebody who is not a supporter of the Catholic Church, anti-clerical, to, in the end, being an upholder of monarchy and the Church before he himself seizes power and then allies himself with both the monarchy and the Church. Now, his path to power included the Squadristi, which were a group of black-shirted thugs, generally veterans of World War I, who really had a hard time giving up the violence of World War I. And they use tactics of violence and intimidation, burning things, killing people, and so on, who were their political enemies. Mussolini started to create a lot of chaos in Italy and then promised the Italian people that he was the one who could keep law and order as long as he was given power. There's a nice image of some of these guys from the Squadristi. They maybe are not quite as frightening as the Free Corps that we saw with Weimar Germany or the early Nazis. You can see that they all have a bunch of canes. You also might see the bicycle there, and you see a guy with a horn. None of these guys probably actually needed a cane to walk. I imagine that they kept those canes with them so they could beat their political opponents. And I do want to remind you that the bicycle is a wonderful symbol of freedom or of movement before the automobile becomes the symbol of freedom and movement for people later. So these Squadristi, these black-shirted thugs, were unleashed by Mussolini on all of his political enemies, people from the far left, like communists and socialists, but even people who were more right-leaning, like political Catholics. Some trade unionists, of course, would be more on the left, but you had a whole bunch of people who were political opponents of the fascists, and the fascists literally took a kind of violent struggle against them. And as fighting in the street between these various groups was happening, in addition to fighting at the ballot box, the government really had no good solution to improving the economy or making the parliamentary democracy work. There's no good solution to rising unemployment. There's no good solution to severe inflation. And so you can imagine that there were elements of Italian society that fixed their problems. In October of 1922, the fascists had a great march on Rome. Mussolini ordered that his squadristi, that his men, march on Rome and seize power. They're basically making a kind of show of force so that the king, who has this power, would appoint Mussolini to be the prime minister or the leader of Italy for 1 year. And in addition to making him the leader of Italy, he also gave Mussolini dictatorial power for that 1 year to see if he could use extreme powers to sort of fix the problems that Italy was facing at this point in time. So Mussolini comes into power legally and was supposed to really only be dictator for about a year and then maybe go back to a more normal. Well, there were still anti-fascists or people who opposed Italy in the parliament. Probably the most vocal of his opponents was a socialist by the name of Matteotti. Some of the squadristi kidnapped Matteotti and killed him, and this caused, as you can imagine, a great political kerfuffle in Italy at this period of time. And a number of people in the Italian parliament demanded from Mussolini that he ban his uniformed thugs, the squadristi, and when Mussolini, of course, refused to do that, 150 of the non-fascist deputies from the parliament resigned in protest. They were in parliament, thinking probably that a new government would have to be formed because of this, and a new election would have to take place. But that didn't happen. Mussolini simply stayed in power, and without having any kind of opposition in the parliament, had the parliament very quickly pass a number of laws which gave him dictatorial power really for the rest of his time. Soon thereafter, his political opponents were arrested. All of the freedoms that one would expect out of a parliamentary democracy were abolished, and Mussolini just started to rule by decree. Unions were disbanded, and Mussolini's secret police was formed and became much more powerful. Now, Mussolini is really kind of an interesting figure. You might want to go onto YouTube and see if you can find some videos of Mussolini giving a speech and some newsreels of Mussolini. Oftentimes he seems kind of like a clown-like figure, really kind of overblown when he's speaking. He seems kind of silly, strutting around and so on. So you might want to do that. He does give a lot of speeches. He plays a kind of virile leader. Once again, he's this strong man. There is video of him wrestling with a tiger cub and bringing in the wheat harvest with a bunch of peasants and so on with his shirt off. He's kind of Putin before Putin became Putin. And he is he's kind of the poster boy of fascism. He more or less invents fascism, proclaims it to be the most modern political philosophy beyond parliamentary democracy, beyond capitalism. He believes that liberalism and capitalism and, of course, socialism are all nonsense. They're all bad political and economic philosophies. He wants people to rally around a kind of national unity. He wants the state to manage the economy. He thinks that national unity and state management of the economy are the way to bring success. The fascist economy for Italy works fairly well in a country that really economically had a lot of problems for a long period of time. There's a lot of talk about battle for this thing or battle for that thing because, once again, it's kind of a militaristic political philosophy. And so there's a battle for wheat. They're trying to increase the amount of wheat that was produced, and really they're trying for autarky, which is a kind of economic self-sufficiency. They don't want to be trading with other nations, because trading with other nations makes the fascists feel like they are weak, that they are reliant upon other nations. So a battle for wheat. Great public works projects were created. A good example of that is all of the money that they spent on Rome, making it a kind of imperial capital once again, and beautifying it, creating roads and railroads and hydroelectric projects, draining swamps so that they could plant things where the swamp used to be, and really just trying to make the economy work really, really well without a lot of help from the outside. Now, while fascist Italy did pretty well, especially when one considers the economic fortunes of Italy in earlier times or even later times, Italy really doesn't achieve the industrialization that it would have needed to successfully prosecute World War II. A little bit more information about the economy in Italy. It is a corporative state where the economy was divided into 22 different parts or corporations, and each one of those corporations or each one of those parts decided the wages and the prices and the policies of that particular part of the economy. They, of course, also controlled the unions. Organized labor was really under the control of the corporation, rather than as an independent force that might be able to stand up against the fascist state. And so things like strikes and lockouts and labor unrest were all banned. This seems like the state is ending social conflict and class conflict, and once again is moving beyond that in a kind of much more modern way. But in a sense, what's happening is the fascists are putting a gun to the head of the workers and to the owners and basically saying, let's all just get along and not have any kind of unrest anymore. One of the major topics or problems that existed from the onset of Italy all the way up until the late 1920s was the Roman question, or what to do about Rome, what to do about the Pope. The popes were angry, of course, with the state of Italy because of the way that Italy was unified, and that the papal states were taken by Piedmont, Sardinia, and created or put into the Italian state. And so successive popes were angry about that, and successive popes then told good Catholics, political Catholics, people of faith, that they couldn't support Italy, which, we've seen this situation before many times, made it difficult to be a good Catholic and a good Italian. Well, there was a kind of agreement that was made in February of 1929 called the Lateran Accord, or once again, it's a concordat with the papacy, very much like the one that Napoleon had with the papacy back in his time. This gives Pius XI, or the Pope, the Vatican as an independent state within Rome. The Italian state then paid the Pope, or paid the Catholic Church, for the losses of land that occurred during Italian unification. It also made the Catholic Church the official state church of fascist Italy. And really this Lateran Accord, or this agreement, provided a lot of legitimacy to the fascist party, to fascism itself, and of course to Mussolini, who at one point in time, as I mentioned, was just a kind of wild-eyed anti-clerical socialist. It also makes sense because both the Catholic Church and fascism are ideologically right-wing, fascism being much, much farther to the right, but still the Catholic Church has a lot of the same kinds of beliefs of keeping hierarchy in place, or women in their own particular sphere, and those sorts of things. Well, militarism and glory is really quite important. If you're always strutting around in uniforms and boasting about how powerful your state is, then you have to kind of put your money where your mouth is at some point in time. And the military was increased in size and effectiveness throughout the 1930s. They spent a lot of money in the early 1930s to buy tanks and aircraft and and ships and so on, really trying to create a military that is going to get a return of Roman glory to Italy. There was in the late 1800s, there was an attempt to take over Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. You might remember when we were talking about new imperialism. Once again, the Italians attack Ethiopia in order to unify their African colonies. I'll show you a map here in just a second. The leader of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia at this point in time, was an emperor by the name of Haile Selassie, and his troops were defeated by the Italians. Their troops really have the very same rifles and very same machine guns that they had in 1898 when they were defeated, or when they staved off the Italian assault. And it was a very brutal kind of conquest. Somewhere near 500,000 Ethiopians were killed, whereas about 5,000 Italians were killed. And imagine that the reason for that had to do with the increasing technologies that the Italians had from World War I, such as airplanes and poison gas and big artillery pieces and tanks and so on. Really quite unfair, and really kind of a harkening back once again to that new imperialism period of time. It's not a very fair thing, but it gives Mussolini kind of a feather to put into his cap and claim that, the Italians are great people once again. The League of Nations, which you might remember was created in order to stop these kinds of things from happening, and all of the various treaties and so on that had been agreed to in the 1920s, were simply ignored. And that's really what you have with fascist states. They don't really care about keeping the peace. And the League of Nations was both outraged and really, really quite ineffective in stopping fascist Italy from taking over Ethiopia. Soon thereafter, Italy or Mussolini sent so-called volunteers, about 50,000 of his troops, to support the right, or support the fascist side in the Spanish Civil War that broke out between the left and the right, that we'll talk about very soon. That was very helpful, I think, for the fascist leader of Spain, a guy by the name of Franco, in winning the Civil War. Sorry for the spoiler. Here you can see some of the Italian possessions. Libya became part of Italy around 1912 or so as a colony. And then over here in East Africa, you have Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia, and Eritrea as part of this East African Italian empire. This is from 1936. Well, we talk about totalitarian states of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and Italy, and of those three, I think Italy is the least totalitarian, or the one that controls their population totally the least. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the nature of Italian culture. Italian culture seems to be kind of a culture of enjoying life and kind of taking it easy, and these totalitarian states really need to be based on hatred and sort of efficient killing and terror and so on. There is, without a doubt, some terror that happens during the fascist Italy period of time, and people praise Mussolini for making the trains finally run on time in a country where, oftentimes there's a kind of disorganization and chaos in general. Unemployment certainly was reduced. The economy was running really quite well during the Great Depression, where other capitalist liberal democracies are really failing. And communism was kept into check, and liberalism was kept in check. And it seemed like Italy really was a kind of well-oiled machine running effectively under an authoritarian leader. And that's what it looked like from the outside. But really, when fascist Italy is tested in World War II, it turns out to be just a paper tiger. It looked frightening, but then was really unable to, once again, put its money where its mouth was, and actually take over a lot of territory and be successful in World War II. And you'll see that really fairly soon after the Italians jump into World War II, World War II destroys fascist Italy and Mussolini is overthrown. But that is for another day. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. I urge you to go and read the section on this and then take the reading quiz, and then you will be counted as here for the day. Thanks so much, and any questions, please email me or contact me. Have a great day. Bye-bye.